The bell shattered the afternoon. It was the kind of sound that did not ask permission. The courthouse bell of Harlan Creek, Texas, swung on its iron hinge with all the violence of a cannon shot, and the sound rolled down Main Street like a wave breaking over shallow rock. It was 1882, and the town was loud with the ambitions of men who had never learned to be quiet. Edna Slater flinched. She did not mean to. She had spent 3 years teaching herself not to flinch, not to show the particular quality of fear that lived inside her body like a splinter too deep to pull free. But the bell caught her in the one unguarded moment she had allowed herself all week, standing just outside the dry goods store with a basket on her arm and her face turned upward toward the sky. And when it rang, she drew backward and her shoulders came up and her breath left her entirely. Monroe Ellsworth saw it. He had been leaning against the post outside the land office across the street, one boot crossed over the other, rolling a cigarette he had no real intention of smoking. He had been watching the town, which was what he did when he had nothing better to occupy his hands. He had been watching the way the dust moved between the buildings and the way the horses tied to the rail shifted their weight, and then he had been watching her without fully deciding to, because there was something about the woman with the dark braid and the gray dress that made him forget to look at anything else. And when the bell rang and she flinched, he moved. He did not think about it. His body decided before his mind assembled the reasons. He pushed off the post and crossed the street in 4 long strides, and he placed himself between Edna Slater and the bell tower without a single word spoken. He simply stood there, his broad back to the sound, facing her, blocking the source of it the way a man steps between a child and a fire. She looked up at him with eyes the color of creek water after rain, dark green and opaque with things she was not saying. He did not explain himself. He did not make it a moment of charity or pity. He just looked back at her, steady as a fence post, as the bell finished its rolling complaint and the town returned to its regular noise. Then he touched the brim of his hat, one small deliberate motion, and he walked away. Edna stood in the street with her basket and her unsteady heartbeat, and the absolute certainty that she had just encountered something she was entirely unprepared for. 3 days before that moment, Edna Slater had arrived in Harlan Creek, Texas, with one trunk, $14 sewn into the hem of her coat, and a name she could not use. Her real name, the name she had been born with, was Edna Morrow. The name Slater had belonged to a man she had married in Abilene, Kansas, when she was 22 and desperate, and unable to see any other road forward. Gerald Slater had been 41 and charming in the particular way of men who have practiced charm like a trade, who deploy it with the same calculation that a card player deploys a good hand, watching for the return. The marriage had lasted 14 months. Gerald Slater was not a man who raised his fists, which was the thing Edna had checked for, having learned from the women around her that this was the primary danger to watch for in a man. Gerald Slater raised his voice instead, and he raised it at unexpected moments, at volume that seemed designed not merely to communicate, but to startle, to destabilize, to remind her at all times that the world could explode without warning, and that she was the cause of it. He kept her in a state of constant readiness for disaster. He slammed doors and dropped heavy objects and laughed too loudly at nothing. And over the 14 months of their marriage, Edna had developed a nervous system that functioned like a hair trigger, a body that was perpetually braced for impact. She had left him on a Tuesday in October. She had planned it for 6 weeks, which was the amount of time it had taken her to accumulate enough money and enough nerve in equal measure. She had taken a job as a seamstress without telling Gerald, doing alterations for the wife of the feed store owner, working during the hours Gerald spent at the saloon. She had saved $2.30 a week, and she had told herself that it was enough, that 28 days was enough planning, that waiting longer would cost her more than money. She had been right about that last part at least. She had taken a train south and then west, changing lines twice, buying tickets with cash and giving false names at the boarding houses along the route. She had arrived in Harlan Creek because it was small enough that a stranger could become invisible quickly and large enough that there was actual work to be found. She had heard about it from a woman in the train car between Waco and San Antonio, a woman traveling alone who had mentioned that the town's schoolteacher had recently married the local pastor and left her position, and that the school board had been advertising for a replacement for the better part of 2 months without success. Edna had a teaching certificate from the state of Kansas. She had carried it in the bottom of her trunk through every move and every change of address the way some women carry a lock of a baby's hair, as proof of a self that had existed before certain choices had narrowed the world down. She had presented herself to the Harlan Creek School Board on the morning of her first full day in town. There were 3 men on the board: Cornelius Hatch, who ran the bank; Theodore Potts, who owned the lumber mill; and Reverend Archibald Finch, who was more interested in her moral character than in her arithmetic. She had answered their questions with careful precision and demonstrated her knowledge, and agreed to a salary of $32 per month, which was less than she deserved but more than she had, and she had left their meeting feeling for the first time in well over a year that she might actually survive what she had done. The school term was due to begin in 1 week, which gave her time to prepare the schoolroom and make herself known in town. She had taken a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Calhoun, a woman of approximately 55 who had the particular economy of movement that comes from doing everything alone for a very long time. Mrs. Calhoun was not warm, but she was fair, and she did not ask questions about where a woman had come from, which was worth more than warmth. It was on her 3rd day in Harlan Creek, doing her ordinary marketing, that the courthouse bell had rung and Monroe Ellsworth had moved between her and the sound without a word. She thought about it all afternoon. She thought about it while she organized the schoolroom, stacking the primers in order of difficulty, and checking the chalk supply, and wiping down the desks with a rag damp from the water pump out back. She thought about the specific quality of what he had done, not the offering of help or the asking of permission, but the simple, instinctive act of putting himself between a woman and something that had frightened her. She thought about his face, which was not classically handsome but was deeply particular, weathered and angular, with a jaw that suggested considerable stubbornness and eyes that had been, in the brief moment she had looked directly into them, an extraordinary amber brown, the color of creek water over rust-colored stone. She thought about the fact that he had not said anything. That was the part she kept returning to. Every man she had known in her adult life had used words as instruments of control, as tools for shaping her understanding of reality into a version that suited them. Gerald Slater had used words like other men used rope, and the silence in which Monroe Ellsworth had performed his small protective act felt, to Edna's worn-out nervous system, like water after a long dry season. She did not let herself make too much of it. She was a woman who had made too much of things before and had the particular scars to show for it, but she thought about it. Monroe Ellsworth had been in Harlan Creek for 7 months, which was 3 months longer than he had planned to stay. He had arrived in late spring of 1882 as a range detective, hired by the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association to investigate the disappearance of cattle from 3 different ranches in the surrounding county. The work was supposed to take 2 months at most. He had a gift for it, for moving quietly through a landscape and reading the signs that other men overlooked, for gaining the confidence of people who had reason to distrust strangers, for assembling the small and scattered pieces of a puzzle into a picture that made prosecutable sense. The cattle theft had turned out to be more complicated than anyone had advertised. There was a network involved, not merely a few opportunistic rustlers, but a systematic operation with connections that reached into the town itself, and untangling it had required more time and more patience than the original job had suggested. He had solved the core of it in July, but there were still loose ends, men who had not yet been brought to account, and he had stayed because he was a man who finished what he started. He was 34 years old. He had been born in Georgia and raised on a cattle operation that had been destroyed by the war when he was 16, and the years since had been a long education in self-sufficiency and the kind of solitude that becomes, over time, indistinguishable from preference. He had worked as a ranch hand and a scout and a deputy marshal before finding his particular aptitude as a detective, and the work suited him because it required exactly the qualities he had been forced to develop in a life lived mostly alone: patience, observation, and the ability to remain emotionally unreadable in almost any situation. He was not a man who startled easily or moved impulsively. Except apparently, when a woman in a gray dress flinched at a loud sound in a way that told him, with the certainty of a man trained to read involuntary human responses, that she had spent a significant portion of her life being frightened by them. He tried not to think about it too extensively. He was good at not thinking about things too extensively. It was a skill he had cultivated with the same deliberate effort that other men cultivated their roping arm or their poker face, and it had served him well in a life that contained a number of things that did not benefit from prolonged examination. But she stayed in his mind the way certain things do, not loudly but persistently, like a song heard only partially that the brain insists on finishing. He made inquiries, discreetly and indirectly, because discretion and indirection were his professional baseline. By evening, he knew that her name was Edna Slater, that she was the new schoolteacher, that she was boarding at Mrs. Calhoun's establishment, and that she had arrived from somewhere up north without any family to speak of. He knew from Ted Gibbs at the dry goods store that she had a quiet manner and particular taste in flour, and that she had paid for her purchases in cash. He knew nothing that he should not know from ordinary small-town gossip. He also knew that the flinch had been specific and practiced, the flinch of a woman with a history, and that the knowledge sat in his chest with a weight he was not entirely comfortable with. He ate his supper alone at the restaurant on the south end of Main Street, as he did most evenings, and he read the newspaper that arrived 3 days late from San Antonio, and he did not allow himself to do anything as foolish as riding past the boarding house to see if her light was on. He merely happened to walk past it on his way back to his room at the hotel, and he merely happened to notice that the window on the second floor, east corner, showed the warm yellow square of a lamp burning. He told himself it was the habit of observation. He was, after all, a detective. The first time they spoke was 4 days after the incident with the bell. Edna was at the library, which in Harlan Creek was a single room attached to the back of the newspaper office containing approximately 200 books, most of them donated, some of them mildewed and half-readable and loved nonetheless. She was looking for anything useful to supplement the school's curriculum, which was thin even by frontier standards, when she heard the door open and turned to find Monroe Ellsworth filling the frame of it. He stopped when he saw her, not with surprise exactly, but with something more deliberate, as if he had made a calculation and then made it again. "Miss Slater," he said. She had not known he knew her name. The knowledge that he did produced a complicated sensation, not quite alarm but something adjacent to it, something that was also, she admitted to herself, something adjacent to pleasure. "I am afraid you have me at a disadvantage," she said. "You know my name." "Monroe Ellsworth," he said. "I work for the Cattle Raisers Association. I have been in town some months." "A detective," she said, because she had made her own inquiries in the careful sideways manner of a woman who needed information without appearing to need it. She had asked Mrs. Calhoun, who had told her that Monroe Ellsworth was reputable and solitary, and that he paid his bills on time and never came home in any state that could be called disreputable. "When it's useful to say so," he agreed. He came into the library and went directly to the back shelf, which suggested he was familiar with the collection, and she watched him from the corner of her eye as she continued her own browsing. He pulled a volume on Texas land law, examined it briefly, and replaced it. He pulled another on cattle brands and kept it. "The school term starts Monday," she said, which was not what she had intended to say. She had intended to say nothing. "I heard," he said. He turned to look at her, and in the small enclosed space of the library his amber eyes were more present than they had been across a street. "Are you ready for it?" "I have been teaching for 4 years," she said. "I am adequately prepared." "That isn't quite what I asked," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said, "I suppose it isn't." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but full. "There's a social at the church hall Saturday evening," he said. "The Women's Aid Society hosts it at the start of each new school term, a welcome for the new teacher usually." "I was informed," she said. "I don't generally attend social occasions," he said. "But I find myself considering an exception." She turned back to the shelf. Her hands were very still, which cost her something. "I see," she said. "I thought you should know," he said, with a dry simplicity that she realized after a beat was humor. She did not smile, but she wanted to, and she was fairly certain he could tell the difference. The social at the church hall was everything Edna had expected, and one thing she had not. She had expected the Ladies' Aid Society to be a coalition of well-meaning women who would take her measure in the first 15 minutes and have their verdict settled before the pie was served. She had expected the men to hover at the edges of the room, drinking weak punch and discussing cattle prices. She had expected the Reverend to make a long speech about the importance of education and Christian virtue, and to look at her throughout it with the particular scrutiny of a man who counted virtue as his professional domain. She had not expected Monroe Ellsworth. He arrived late, which she had noticed immediately, and then immediately chided herself for noticing. He wore a clean, dark coat, and his hat was in his hand, and he moved through the room with the particular economy of a man who has assessed every exit before choosing his position. He found a place near the back wall and stayed there, holding his punch glass and answering when spoken to and watching the room with those amber eyes that missed nothing. He watched her, not obtrusively, not in the way of men who make watching a form of pressure. He watched the way he did everything else, with a still, deliberate quality that communicated attention rather than appetite. She was speaking with Margaret Hatch, the banker's wife, who was enormously kind and not very interesting, and in the middle of a sentence about the new primer she intended to use for the younger students, Edna became aware that Monroe Ellsworth had crossed a quarter of the room in her direction, and had come to a stop at a distance close enough to join the conversation but not so close as to impose himself on it. Margaret Hatch, who was not interesting but was perceptive in the way that socially engaged women often are, looked between them and found a reason to excuse herself. "Mr. Ellsworth," Edna said. "Miss Slater," he said, "you look like you're surviving." "It is rather a lot of evaluation for one evening," she admitted, and was surprised to hear the honesty of it come out so naturally. "Small towns collect information about newcomers like other folks collect stamps," he said. "They don't generally mean anything terrible by it." "And you," she said, "you have been here 7 months. Have they finished collecting information about you?" "They have a working theory," he said. "I let them have it." "What is the theory?" "That I am solitary and competent and not particularly sociable, and that I will leave once my work is finished." "And is that accurate?" she asked. He considered this with a deliberateness that suggested he was not performing consideration but actually engaging in it. "The first 3 parts," he said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the church hall continued its modest noise around them. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for the other day. The street. I did not ask permission before. I don't apologize," she said quickly, and then more quietly, "Please don't apologize for it." Something in his expression shifted, a small seismic thing that would have been invisible to anyone not already paying close attention. He nodded once. "I have been trying to understand what you are doing in Harlan Creek," he said. "A woman with a teaching certificate and a trunk and no family attached." "Teaching," she said. That is what I am doing. I mean no imposition by the question, he said. I know you don't, she said, which was true and which surprised her because her assessment of men's intentions had been badly calibrated by recent experience and she was still in the process of recalibrating. I came for the position. The town advertised. I needed the work. You came from the north, he said. Kansas, she said, which was true and also the minimum of truth. Abilene, he said. Her breath stopped. How the trim on your trunk, he said. It's a specific leatherwork pattern done by a shop on 3rd Street in Abilene. I worked a case up there in '79. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not pressing her. He had offered an observation and he was leaving her the space to do whatever she chose with it. I had reasons to leave, she said. Most people in the West did, he said. That's why there's a West. She almost smiled then. It was very close. He caught it, she could tell, in the barely perceptible easing of the line around his jaw. Dance with me, he said, which was not a demand but was not quite a question either. It was an offering, extended with the same quality of his earlier action on the street, without pressure but without apology. I have not danced in some time, she said. Neither have I, he said. We will be equally poor at it. She set down her punch glass and took his hand, and they moved into the modest space where 3 other couples were dancing to the fiddle music, and it turned out that Monroe Ellsworth was not poor at it at all. He was not showy, but he was sure, and his hand at her waist was present without being claiming, and she found herself, for the first time in a very long time, not thinking about what might come next. Just present in the moment that she was in, which was a scarce and valuable thing. She thought, I'm not safe yet. But she also thought, this man is not what I was afraid he would be. School began on Monday and Edna discovered within the first hour that the 22 children assigned to her care ranged in age from 6 to 14, in temperament from angelic to feral, and in educational background from solidly competent to barely literate. She had taught in a more established school in Abilene, with standardized curriculum and a principal, and at least some institutional support. Teaching in Harlan Creek was more like teaching on a frontier, because it was teaching on a frontier, and the resourcefulness required was of a different order entirely. She loved it immediately. The loving of it surprised her. She had expected to find competence, the reliable professional satisfaction of doing something she was trained to do. She had not expected to find joy, but the morning light came through the schoolroom's south-facing windows and fell across the faces of the children, and they looked at her with the particular readiness of young people who have been waiting for someone to take them seriously, and she felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a long time. She taught reading and arithmetic in the mornings and history and geography in the afternoons, and she stayed late cleaning the chalk from the boards and preparing the next day's lessons, and she walked back to Mrs. Calhoun's in the late golden light of the Texas autumn feeling genuinely tired in the best possible way. Monroe Ellsworth was sometimes at the end of Main Street when she walked back. Not always. Not arranged. But she began to notice the pattern of him, the way he occupied the town's geography at certain hours, and she began to notice that some of those hours overlapped with her own daily movements in a way that might have been coincidence and might have been something considerably more intentional. She did not challenge it. She found herself instead adjusting her own timing in small ways, choosing the route that went past the land office on Tuesday afternoons, taking the longer road home on Thursdays, which went past the livery stable where she knew he sometimes talked with the stable hand in the late afternoons about the comings and goings of riders through the territory. This was new information about herself. She had not known that she was capable of wanting the proximity of a man without fearing it simultaneously. They talked when they met. It was never prearranged, and neither of them acknowledged the pattern, but the conversations were real, substantive exchanges between two people who were, she was coming to understand, more similar in their inner architecture than their external circumstances suggested. Both of them had learned to watch before speaking. Both of them had developed a kind of interior self-sufficiency, that had served as protection against needs that could be used against them. Both of them were, she thought, more alone than they had chosen to be, and less certain than they appeared that this was permanently the case. He told her about the case he was working, in general terms, because he was careful about operational detail, but seemed to find some relief in explaining the shape of a problem to someone who would think about it rather than simply receiving the information. There was a man in Harlan Creek, he told her, who had been facilitating cattle theft and also something more serious, the falsification of land grants, which was robbing smaller ranchers and homesteaders of property they had legally filed for. The man was respected in town and knew how to present a face of legitimacy, and Monroe had spent months building a case that would hold up to the scrutiny of a federal court. "Who is it?" she asked. "I cannot tell you that yet," he said. "Not because I don't trust you, because if you knew you would find it difficult not to feel the knowledge when you spoke to him and he would see it." "You think I am easy to read," she said with a particular edge. "I think you are very skilled at concealment," he said. "I also think you have not had as much practice as you would like with this specific type of secret." He paused. "Also, he is on the school board." She went very still. "Cornelius Hatch," she said. Monroe looked at her. "He looked at me a certain way," she said. "When I came for my interview, not the Reverend's way, not a man deciding if a woman is moral, a man deciding if a woman is useful or if she is a problem." Monroe was quiet for a moment. "You are perceptive," he said. "I have had to be," she said simply. He nodded, and in the nod she understood that he recognized exactly what kind of education produced that kind of perception, and that he did not require her to explain it further, and that he was angry on her behalf in a very quiet, very contained way that she trusted more than any loudly expressed outrage would have been. October deepened into November, and the cottonwood trees along the creek went yellow, and then gold, and then bare, and the mornings became sharp enough to see your breath. Edna kept the schoolroom warm with a cast-iron stove that the children took turns feeding with split wood, and she served hot tea from a battered tin pot at the beginning of each afternoon session, which had no academic justification but was warmly received. She and Monroe had taken to walking on Sunday afternoons, which they had arrived at gradually and without explicit agreement, the way two cautious people arrive at most things, by discovering one week that they had both been walking in the same direction at the same time, and finding that this was more pleasant than walking separately, and then finding the same thing the following week, until it became the shape of their Sundays. On a Sunday in the second week of November, they walked east along the creek road until they reached the old cottonwood grove where the creek made a broad bend, and the sky was very large and very blue, and they sat on the fallen trunk that was the natural seat of that particular spot, and Edna told him about Gerald Slater. She did not plan to. It came out of a conversation about Kansas, and then about Abilene, and then about the ways that small cities could make a woman invisible without removing her from sight. And then it was there, the shape of it in the air between them, and she either told it or left it as a silence that would grow into something she did not want between them. She told it plainly, without drama, the way you describe a wound that has been attended to. This happened, and then this happened, and then I left, and I have been careful to put enough distance between myself and it that it cannot reach me here. Monroe listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer sympathy in the form of noise, which she appreciated enormously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. "He has looked for you?" Monroe asked. "I believe so," she said. "I changed my route and my manner of presenting myself. I did not come from Abilene directly." "Smart," he said. "Necessary," she said. "Same thing sometimes," he said. She looked at him in the afternoon light, and the particular quality of knowing that had been building between them for 2 months was there in the space between their shoulders, which were not quite touching. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice had changed slightly, not in volume but in texture, a rougher quality coming through the control. "I came here for a job. I told myself I would leave when it was finished. I may have been wrong about the second part of that." She looked at the creek. Monroe, she said. I am not pressing you, he said in the same careful, unhurried way he did everything. I would not press you. I only wanted you to know where I stand. You stand very still, she said, for a man with a lot going on inside. He made a sound that was very close to a laugh, low and real. Is that a complaint? No, she said. It is actually the opposite of a complaint. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and the quality of attention in his amber eyes was the kind of thing that took a person apart and put them back together slightly differently. She had been afraid of attention for a very long time. This was not like that. This was the feeling of being seen by someone who intended nothing by the seeing except to understand. I am not ready, she said. I know, he said. But I am not saying no, she said. I know that too, he said. They sat in the cottonwood grove until the sun got low and the air got cold, and he walked her back to Mrs. Calhoun's and left her at the gate, touching his hat in that particular way of his, and she went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed both hands over her heart as if she could feel what was happening inside it. Something was happening inside it. She was not yet certain whether to call it hope or danger, because she had not yet learned to reliably tell the difference. The danger arrived in the second week of November in the form of a letter. Mrs. Calhoun brought it up with the morning tray, a letter in an envelope with the Abilene postmark, and a handwriting on the outside that made Edna's stomach go to ice. Gerald Slater had found her. Not exactly, not with a specific address. She could see that from the postmark that the letter had traveled through 2 forwarding addresses before reaching her, which meant someone had talked, which meant she had less time than she had hoped. The letter itself was Gerald at his most calculated, not threatening, never threatening in any way that could be quoted to an authority, but full of the particular quality of implication that she had spent 14 months learning to decode. He wrote about missing her. He wrote about his concern for her welfare. He wrote about a wife's place beside her husband and the ways in which the world was unkind to women alone, and every sentence was designed to be readable as affection by anyone who had not lived inside its intended meaning. She sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about her options with the clear, cold precision that she had developed in the months since leaving Abilene. He had found the general direction of her, but not, she thought, the specific location. The forwarding had slowed him down but had not stopped him. She estimated she had perhaps 2 or 3 weeks before he had a precise address if he was determined, and Gerald Slater was very determined about things he considered his property. She considered leaving. She had left before. She had a small amount of money now, not much, but enough to move again, to start again somewhere further west, Arizona perhaps, or California. She sat with her hands flat on the table, and she thought about the schoolroom with its south-facing windows and the children who looked at her like she was someone worth looking at. And she thought about Sunday afternoons along the creek, and she was surprised to find that the thought of leaving felt, for the first time in years, like a loss rather than a rescue. She needed to tell Monroe. The decision to tell him was not made lightly. Telling him meant trusting him with the kind of information that could be used against her, and her trust had been badly broken by the one person who was supposed to be its safest recipient. But she thought about 2 months of Sundays and the way he had moved between her and the sound without any requirement that she explain herself, and she thought about the specific quality of a man who finishes what he starts. She found him at the land office, going over documents with the county clerk, and she waited outside, and when he came out and saw her face he was immediately, completely present in the way that was one of the things about him that was hardest to explain to someone who had not been the recipient of it. "Walk with me," he said, not a question. They walked to the far end of the street and she showed him the letter and he read it without expression, which meant he was feeling something he was controlling. When he finished, he refolded it carefully and gave it back to her. "He is coming," Monroe said. "I believe so," she said. "How long before he has a specific address?" 2, perhaps 3 weeks, unless he already has more than I think." Monroe was quiet for a moment thinking, and she could see the way he turned the problem over in his mind, systematic and calm. "Gerald Slater of Abilene," he said. "That is the full name." "Yes. I will make some inquiries," he said. "I have contacts in Kansas. I want to know exactly where he is and what he knows before he gets here." "Monroe," she said, "I need you to understand that he is not a violent man in the way that word is usually meant. He will come here and he will present himself as a concerned husband, and the law will likely see it that way." "Marriage law in the state gives a husband considerable rights," Monroe said, and the flatness in his voice told her he was angry in a way that had no useful outlet in this particular moment. "I know." "So what can you do?" she said. He looked at her, and in his eyes was something she had not seen there before, a heat behind the control that was fierce and specific. "I can find out exactly what Gerald Slater is," he said. "A man who spent 14 months using noise and unpredictability to control his wife and then pursued her across 2 states when she left did not spend his life being careful only inside his marriage. There will be something. There is always something." "You cannot guarantee that," she said. "No," he said, "but I am very good at finding things." He turned to face her fully, and the afternoon light was behind him, and she could see his jaw working slightly with the effort of containing something. "I would also like to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it as a question, not a pressure." "Ask," she said. "If I could arrange the legal protections, would you consider staying?" She looked at him for a long moment. The West spread out behind him, enormous and indifferent and also full of possibility in the way that enormous, indifferent things sometimes are. "Ask me something else first," she said. He understood. She could see him understand it. He took a breath that was not quite steady. "Edna," he said, "I have spent 7 months in this town and 6 weeks trying not to fall entirely in love with you, and I have been unsuccessful at the second part, and I would like your permission to stop trying." It was the most words she had heard from him in one sequence. She thought later that he had saved them up the way a man saves up water in dry country. "You have my permission," she said, and her voice was only slightly unsteady. He reached out and took her hand, not her fingers but her whole hand, covering it with his entirely. They stood in the middle of the street in Harlan Creek, Texas, in November of 1882, and she held his hand and felt something that had been locked for a very long time begin, slowly and with considerable care, to open. Monroe moved fast once he had a direction. He wrote to 2 contacts in Kansas that same evening, one a deputy marshal in Wichita, and one a former Pinkerton man he had worked with on a case in '79 who now ran a small inquiry agency in Topeka. He asked them specific questions about Gerald Slater, his business dealings, his personal history, any complaints lodged with any law enforcement body in the state of Kansas in the past 4 years. He also asked for Gerald Slater's current location, whether he had engaged any agents or legal representation regarding the finding of a missing wife, and whether there was a travel record consistent with movement toward Texas. While he waited for replies, he continued his work on the Hatch case, because the 2 problems were in some ways connected, because Cornelius Hatch sat on the school board and could, if he chose, be an obstacle or an instrument in whatever Gerald Slater chose to do when he arrived. The Hatch case had been building toward its resolution for weeks. Monroe had, through patient accumulated evidence, documented 12 specific instances of forged land grant documentation, testimony from 4 ranchers who had been dispossessed of rightful property, and a paper trail that connected Hatch's bank directly to the subsequent sale of that property at profit. He also had, through a source he would not name even in court if he could help it, the testimony of a man who had worked as Hatch's courier and had transported documents between Hatch and the county land office on specific dates that corresponded to the forgeries. He had been waiting for the right moment to bring it to the federal circuit judge, who was due in Harlan Creek in the 3rd week of November. That timing now had additional urgency. He told Edna what he was doing, not every detail but the shape of it, because she had already demonstrated that she thought clearly and saw what others missed, and because keeping her informed felt like a form of the respect she had not been given enough of. "If Hatch is removed from the school board," she said, "before Gerald arrives, there is one less instrument he could use." "Yes," Monroe said. "And if your federal judge is here and Hatch is in custody, Gerald's ability to present himself as a respectable man seeking a legitimate remedy also becomes more complicated, because the atmosphere of the town is one of legal accountability and scrutiny, and Gerald specifically avoids scrutiny." Monroe looked at her. "You have a systematic mind," he said. "I have a mind that has been applied to survival for several years," she said. "It tends toward the systematic. I want you to understand," he said, "that whatever happens with Gerald Slater, I am going to help you, not because you need a man to manage your problems, because I am the man who wants to stand next to you while you manage them." She looked at him with those Creekwater eyes that had started to show him things that she had previously kept behind their opacity. "I have not had that," she said. "I know," he said. "I do not know yet entirely how to receive it," she said. "I have time," he said. "We have time." She reached up and put one hand against his jaw, which was the first touch she had initiated between them, and his eyes closed briefly and then opened, and he turned his face into her palm in a movement so involuntary and so honest that she felt it move through her entire body. "Monroe," she said softly. "Edna," he said, in a voice like stone warmed by sun. He kissed her then, gently, carefully, with the same quality of deliberate attention that characterized everything he did. Her breath left and returned different. She held the front of his coat with both hands, and he held her face with both hands, and the cold November wind moved around them, and none of it mattered at all. The first reply from Kansas arrived 4 days later. It was from his Pinkerton contact, a man named Reeves who was thorough and fast, and had no personal investment in the answer, which made his information reliable. Gerald Slater had been investigated twice for financial fraud in Abilene, once in 1879 and once in 1881, both times in connection with land deals that had disadvantaged the other party in ways that were technically within the law but only barely. More significantly, there was a complaint from a woman, a dressmaker named Agnes Polk, who had claimed in the spring of 1882 that Gerald Slater had coerced her into signing documents under duress. The complaint had not been prosecuted because Agnes Polk had subsequently recanted, but the original complaint was on file and Reeves had obtained a copy. There was also a travel record. Gerald Slater had departed Abilene by train on November 3rd. He was traveling south through Texas. Based on the route, he was likely in Waco or San Antonio at this point. He had with him a lawyer named Clifford Price who specialized in domestic desertion cases. Monroe read the letter twice and then walked directly to where Edna was preparing her lessons for the following week. "He left Abilene on the 3rd, Monroe said. "He has a lawyer." She absorbed this without visible collapse, which he had come to expect from her and which he found every time both admirable and heartbreaking. "How long?" she said. 4 to 7 days, depending on his connections." She nodded slowly. "And Hatch, I am presenting to the judge day after tomorrow," Monroe said. "I moved the timeline up." She looked at him steadily. "What do I do?" "Keep teaching," he said immediately. "Keep your routine. Give nothing away. You do nothing differently." He paused. "And I need you to trust me." "I do," she said, and the simplicity of it struck him somewhere he had not expected to be struck. The presentation to the federal circuit judge went better than Monroe had dared plan for. Judge Elias Carmody was 60 years old and had been administering federal law on the Texas circuit for 11 years, and had developed in that time a profound hostility toward the specific type of corruption that took advantage of poorly documented land records and the isolation of frontier property owners. He reviewed Monroe's evidence with the focus of a man who had been waiting for exactly this package, and by the end of the afternoon session, he had issued a warrant for Cornelius Hatch's arrest on charges of fraud and forgery. Cornelius Hatch was arrested on a Thursday morning while he was unlocking the door of the Harlan Creek Savings Bank. The effect on the town was the specific quality of shock that belongs to the exposure of a secret everyone has half known but not permitted themselves to fully believe. There was outrage and disbelief, and then, as the evidence spread through the social network of the town with the speed of water finding level, a grim and unsurprised confirmation in many people who had harbored private suspicions for years. Margaret Hatch, Edna was relieved to find, had known nothing of her husband's dealings and was treated with the community's sympathy rather than its condemnation. She was a woman who had been used by proximity the way Edna understood being used by proximity, and Edna took her a meal and sat with her that afternoon and said nothing about her own understanding, but communicated it through the simple act of not leaving. Gerald Slater arrived in Harlan Creek on a Friday afternoon in the third week of November. Edna knew he was coming because Monroe had people watching the stage routes and the train connections, and the word came to her in the schoolroom at 2 in the afternoon through the child of the stable master, a quick-footed boy named Thomas, who handed her a folded note between arithmetic and history and departed before she could thank him. She read the note once and put it in her apron pocket and finished the afternoon session without any change in her manner, which she considered afterward to be one of the strongest things she had ever done. Gerald Slater was not physically large. That was always the first thing people expected and then were wrong about. He was middle height and had the kind of careful attractiveness of a man who had cultivated his appearance as a professional tool, well-dressed, cleanly barbered, with an open expression practiced to the point of reflex. When he stepped off the afternoon stage in Harlan Creek, he looked like any prosperous businessman, which was exactly the problem. Monroe watched him arrive from across the street. He had the lawyer confirmed as well, a slight man with a leather case who stepped down after Slater and began talking before both his feet were on the ground. Monroe had spent the 2 days since Hatch's arrest ensuring that he had the legal authority to do what he needed to do, and he had spent the evening with Judge Carmody in a long and productive conversation that had resulted in a document he currently carried in his inside coat pocket. He let Gerald Slater and his lawyer establish themselves at the hotel and eat their supper. He let them have the evening, because they needed to believe they had arrived quietly and unknown, and because the morning would serve better for what he intended. Edna spent that Friday night at Mrs. Calhoun's, which was where she always spent her evenings, and she did not sleep but she lay in bed with extraordinary stillness, because she had learned to be still when stillness was required, and she thought about the specific question of what her life was going to be, and what it was going to cost, and what she was not going to give up. She was not going to give up the schoolroom. She was not going to give up the children with their morning faces in the south window light. She was not going to give up Sunday afternoons along the creek. She was not going to give up the amber eyes of a man who had moved between her and the sound without a word. She thought, I have spent 3 years in retreat. I am finished retreating. Monroe was at the hotel at 8 in the morning. He found Gerald Slater and Clifford Price in the hotel's small dining room, eating breakfast, and he walked directly to their table and stood at the end of it and said, Gerald Slater, in a tone that was not loud but had the quality of a door closing. Both men looked up. Monroe placed a document on the table. Monroe Ellsworth, Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, licensed as a range detective under the Texas statutes. This is a courtesy notification that you are currently in a jurisdiction under active federal investigation, and that any legal actions filed here this week will be subject to the scrutiny of the Federal Circuit Court currently in session. Gerald Slater's open expression did not change. He was very good, Monroe noted. He had the practiced blankness of a man accustomed to receiving information without reacting to it. I am here on a personal matter, Slater said pleasantly. My wife. Your former wife, Monroe said, By my understanding, under Kansas law. Under Kansas law you have certain claims, Monroe said. Your lawyer can speak to those. But your lawyer will also want to be aware that under Texas law, a woman may petition for divorce on grounds of abandonment, which Mrs. Slater formally filed 3 days ago through Judge Carmody's court. This was the document that had been in his pocket. He had spent the better part of Wednesday with Judge Carmody and with Edna, guiding her through the filing process, explaining each step in the Texas divorce statute, ensuring that she understood both what she was signing and what it meant. The lawyer, Clifford Price, was now reading the document with the expression of a man recalculating. Furthermore, Monroe said, keeping his voice level, I have in my possession documentation of 2 fraud investigations in Kansas, copies of a sworn complaint filed by one Agnes Polk of Abilene in the spring of last year, and correspondence between yourself and a land agent in Abilene, whose activities are currently under investigation by the Kansas territorial authorities. He paused. None of this is relevant to a divorce proceeding in Texas, of course. But a man in a federal court town who is currently facing a domestic legal action might find that these things become relevant in ways that are inconvenient. Gerald Slater put down his fork. For the first time, his expression had changed. Under the practiced pleasantness, there was something cold and calculating, and Monroe looked at it without flinching and let him see exactly how much it was going to accomplish in this room. What do you want? Slater said. I want you to consult with your lawyer, Monroe said, and then I want you to sign the response that Judge Carmody's court will be preparing this morning, consenting to the divorce proceedings, and then I want you to get on the afternoon stage. And if I don't? Slater said, quietly, with the particular threat, that is not quite a threat that Monroe recognized from Edna's description. Then you are welcome to pursue your legal options through the court, Monroe said. And I will pursue mine regarding the Kansas matters, and we will see which resolution is faster and which is more comfortable for you. The lawyer leaned over and murmured something in Slater's ear. Monroe waited. Gerald Slater looked at him for a long moment with those cold, calculated eyes. Monroe held the look without any of the markers of anxiety or urgency that Slater was looking for and not finding. Monroe had sat across tables from cattlemen and rustlers, and corrupt officials and men with actual guns pointed in his direction. And Gerald Slater, for all his particular cruelty, was the least frightening of them in terms of immediate physical danger. Fine, Slater said finally, in a clipped, compressed way. I will speak with my lawyer. Monroe touched his hat. I will be at the courthouse from 9 o'clock, he said. Judge Carmody holds morning session at 10. He left the hotel and walked directly to the schoolhouse, which was 3 blocks east, and he found Edna at her desk with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed in the particular way it was when she was applying everything she had to remaining calm. He is consulting with his lawyer, Monroe said. She looked up at him. What do you think he will do? I think he will sign, Monroe said. He is a man who makes calculations. The calculation does not favor a fight in this jurisdiction at this time. She stood up from her desk. In the morning light of the schoolroom, with the empty desks around her and the primers stacked neatly, and the map of the United States on the east wall that she had brought from her trunk, she looked like herself in a way that he had been watching her approach for 2 months and was only now fully arriving at. She crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough that he could see her breathing. And after? She said, after the divorce is filed and he is gone, Monroe said, you are Edna Slater of Harlan Creek, Texas, schoolteacher in full legal standing, free and clear. She pressed her lips together and her eyes went bright and she did not cry, which was a form of dignity that he respected enormously. And then she put both arms around him and held on, her face against his chest, and he put his arms around her and held her back, and they stood in the schoolroom in the morning light for a long time without either of them saying anything at all. Gerald Slater signed the consent documents at 11 that Thursday morning. He departed on the afternoon stage as requested. Monroe watched the stage roll out of Harlan Creek with a certain quality of completion, the closing of a case, the resolution of a problem. He had done it countless times in his professional life, and the feeling was never quite personal, just the satisfying click of a lock engaging. This time it was very personal. He thought about that as he walked back from the stage depot, about the particular difference between a job and a reason, between competence and investment, between solving a problem because it was a problem and solving it because the outcome mattered to him in a way that reached through all his professional training and touched something much older and much more essential. He had been alone for a long time, not by accident or not entirely. There was an architecture to his solitude that he had built deliberately after a loss early in his adult life that he had not spoken of to many people. His engagement to a woman in Georgia had ended when she had died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1873, a loss that had been clean and total in the way of early deaths. No unresolved argument, no betrayal, just the sudden and irreversible absence of a future he had been certain of. He had dealt with it by moving and by working and by allowing the years to do what years do, which is not to heal exactly, but to create a distance between the acute edge of grief and the present moment. He had not expected to find himself in this territory again. He had not been looking for it. But Edna Slater had been standing in a street with her face turned up to the sky, and a bell had rung and something in him had moved before he could think about it. And now here he was, walking back through the center of Harlan Creek in the November cold with something warm and complicated and entirely real occupying the place where he had been keeping empty space for 9 years. He was going to have to be careful with her. She had been through something that left marks that did not disappear quickly, and he knew better than most that the residue of fear does not simply evacuate, because the immediate source of it is removed. She would startle at sudden sounds for a long time to come. She would need him, on particular occasions, to be where he was and to be still, and to ask nothing of her except to let herself believe what the evidence showed, which was that she was safe. He was prepared for all of that. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was more than prepared. He was eager for it, which was a word he had not applied to much in the preceding years. The prospect of being the person Edna Slater trusted with her unguarded moments felt like the best use he had yet found for everything he was. He went to the schoolhouse that afternoon after the children had gone home, and he found her at the chalkboard erasing the day's lessons with slow, deliberate strokes, and he stood in the doorway and she turned and looked at him. "He is gone," Monroe said. She closed her eyes for one brief moment. When she opened them, they were clear and direct. "Thank you," she said. "I know what that cost you." "It cost me nothing," he said. "You threatened to expose him with information that would have distracted your Kansas contacts from your actual work," she said. "You called in favors from people you will need again. Do not tell me it cost nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "It cost me less than the alternative," he said. She set down the eraser and came toward him, and she stopped just in front of him, which was a distance she had been slowly and steadily decreasing over the weeks, and she looked up at him with the full weight of her attention. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because of what you did. I want you to hear that. I want to stay because this is the first place in years that has felt like something I can build in, and because the children deserve a teacher who isn't going to leave them, and because there is a man in this town who has been standing between me and the frightening things without asking me to explain why they are frightening." She paused. "I want to stay for all of those reasons." "I am glad to hear that," Monroe said. "But I want to know," she said, "what your reasons are for staying." He looked at her for a moment. "The job is finished," he said. "Hatch is in custody. The case is filed. Professionally, there is nothing holding me here." "So," she said. "So I am going to tender my resignation from the association," he said. "And I am going to speak to Theodore Potts at the lumber mill about the deputy county sheriff position he mentioned to me 2 months ago, and which I have been not thinking about very carefully until now, and I am going to get a house instead of a hotel room." He paused. If that is all right with you. Edna Slater stood in her schoolroom in Harlan Creek, Texas, in the last light of a November afternoon, and she looked at Monroe Ellsworth with the full force of a woman who has come a very long way to find exactly this, and she said, "Yes, that is very much all right with me." He kissed her then in the schoolroom, which was probably not strictly appropriate, and which she did not for a single moment object to. December came to Harlan Creek with frost on the windshields of the store windows, and wood smoke in the air, and the particular quality of Texas winter light that is more gold than any other season because it is so much lower in the sky. The school term moved into its rhythm of accomplishment and noise, and the satisfaction of watching children who could not read in September reading in December, which never got old no matter how many times you witnessed it. Monroe moved out of the hotel and into a house on the north end of town, a two-room frame house with a porch that faced east and a wood stove that drew well and a view of the creek through the bare cottonwoods. He accepted the deputy sheriff position, which paid less than range detective work, but came with a house allowance, and did not require him to be anywhere other than the one place he had decided to be. The outgoing deputy, a man named Hargrove who was retiring due to a persistent knee complaint, spent 2 weeks transferring the institutional knowledge of the county to Monroe with the gratitude of a man handing off a burden he had been carrying too long. Monroe was good at the work in the same ways he had been good at the detective work: the patience and the observation and the willingness to understand a situation before acting on it. The community, which had been shaken by the Hatch affair, found in him a kind of steadiness that was reassuring without being authoritarian, and within a month of his taking the position, there was a general consensus that the county had done well. He and Edna kept their Sunday walks. They kept the habit of meeting in the evenings, at Mrs. Calhoun's where he came for supper twice a week, or at the restaurant, or simply walking in the cold, clear evenings with their breath making small clouds, and the stars very bright and very close overhead, the way they are in Texas away from any city light. He told her about Georgia and about the woman he had lost, and she listened the way he had listened to her in the Cottonwood Grove, with the quality of attention that asks for nothing and offers everything. She did not compete with the grief or belittle it or try to explain it away. She simply held it with him for the space of the telling, and when he finished she said, "I am glad she was loved," which was exactly the right thing and not a thing he would have thought to ask for. He told her he loved her for the first time on a Thursday evening in the middle of December, standing on the front porch of his house with the frost showing on the grass and the stars overhead like extravagance. He said it in the same direct, unhurried way he did everything, without preamble or apology, as a statement of fact that also happened to be the most important thing he had ever said to anyone. She stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "I love you too," and her voice was steady and clear, with a depth under it like water under clear ice, and he felt the words land in him the way important things land, not gently but truly. He asked her to marry him in January. He did not make a production of it, because she was not a woman who needed production, who had in fact been damaged by the kind of elaborate performances that men put on when they want something and do not want to call the wanting by its name. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon, sitting by the stove in his house with coffee, in the middle of an ordinary conversation about what she was going to teach the children about geography in February. He said, "Edna, will you marry me?" And she looked at him over her coffee cup with those eyes that had been opening steadily over the months of their acquaintance, like a flower that blooms in cold weather, slow and deliberate, and all the more beautiful for the conditions required to produce it. She said, "Yes, Monroe," and went back to her geography plans, which he took to mean she was profoundly happy and processing it in the manner of a woman who expresses deep feeling through action rather than performance. 45 minutes later she set down her lesson book and said, "I am very happy," and he said, "I know," and she said, "You really do always know, don't you?" and he said, "It's a useful skill in my line of work," and she said, Your line of work is currently cattle regulation and keeping the peace in a very small county. And he said, I meant loving you as my line of work. And she looked at him with the full warmth of a woman who has learned, carefully and at considerable cost, to receive what is being offered. They were married on the 14th of February, 1883, which was a Tuesday and also happened to be Valentine's Day, which Edna had not planned but had noticed and found quietly funny. Reverend Finch performed the ceremony in the small church at the center of Harlan Creek with half the town in attendance, including every student from the school and their families. Margaret Hatch was there, and Mrs. Calhoun, and Theodore Potts and his wife, and the stable master's boy Thomas, who had run the message to the schoolroom in November, and who was clearly very pleased with the role he had played in the entire business. Edna wore a dress she had made herself, from fabric she had chosen with Monroe, a deep blue wool that was the color of the sky in the middle of the day. She wore her dark hair pinned but not severely, and Monroe stood at the front of the church in his best dark coat and his hat in his hand, and when she came down the aisle he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with the full weight of his attention and the still, particular warmth that she had come to understand was his version of everything. She thought of the street and the bell and the way he had placed himself between her and the sound. She thought, I did not know that was the beginning. The Reverend said the words, and they said the words back, and Monroe held her hand through the whole of it, and she felt the specific quality of a thing being decided, not chosen in the light moment of choice, but decided in the deep part of a life, settled and real and going nowhere. Spring came to Harlan Creek, and the cottonwoods along the creek put out their new leaves, and the school year moved toward its close with the satisfying momentum of work nearly finished. Edna had, by the end of her first full term, raised the reading levels of every student in her classroom, and had established a small lending library within the schoolroom itself, using donated books and a contribution from the Women's Aid Society, and had applied for a second teacher to handle the younger grades, which had grown to a size that one teacher could not adequately manage. She and Monroe lived in the house on the north end of town, which Monroe had expanded with a third room over the winter. They had a routine that accommodated both of them with the particular ease of two people who have sufficiently compatible habits and sufficiently similar values, which is the combination that makes a daily life not merely bearable but genuinely pleasurable. He was up before her always, and had coffee on when she came down. She made supper most evenings, and he cleaned up after it. On Sundays they walked along the creek, which had become in spring an entirely different proposition, with the water running fast and green, and the birds in the willows, and the whole world smelling of mud and new growth. She still flinched sometimes at loud sounds, at unexpected noises, at the moments when the world offered something it had not warned her about. She did not think she would stop entirely, not for a long time, maybe not ever. The body remembers what it has been taught, and 14 months of careful conditioning does not disappear in a season. But when she flinched, Monroe was there. Not always in a physical sense, not always positioned between her and the source of the sound, but in the way of a man who has integrated someone else's vulnerability into his understanding of the world. He anticipated the moments that would be difficult and made himself available for them, without turning them into things that required explanation or management. He was simply present, steady and warm and without agenda, and over time the flinching became less frequent because her nervous system was slowly learning a new truth about the world, that loud sounds did not always herald danger, that the person beside her was not the source of unpredictability but the antidote to it. She thought about this sometimes in the mornings, lying in the warm dark of their room with his breathing next to her, this extraordinary reversal that had taken a body trained to fear and was gently, patiently, persistently retraining it to rest. She thought, I did not know love could do this. I thought love was the thing you were managed by. She thought, I was wrong about a great many things, and I was right to leave, and I was right to come here, and I was right to trust the man who moved without being asked. In June, 2 months after the close of the school term, Edna told Monroe she was expecting a child. She told him on the porch in the evening, with the first fireflies beginning to appear over the grass and the air warm and soft. She was not nervous, exactly, but she was attentive to his response in the way of someone for whom the responses of others have historically been uncertain variables. Monroe was very still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and his amber eyes had the particular quality she had first noticed in the cottonwood grove that November Sunday, the heat behind the control, the fierce warmth that his normal steadiness kept at a measured distance. He reached over and took her hand. "Edna," he said, and his voice was different, rougher and warmer and entirely without its habitual containment. "A boy or a girl," she said, because she had to say something practical or she was going to do something undignified. "We will not know for months." "It does not matter," he said. "No," she said, "it really doesn't." He brought her hand to his mouth and kissed it, her knuckles, her palm, in a long deliberate sequence that was nothing like the restrained gestures of a man managing his distance, and entirely like a man who had given up all interest in managing his distance. "We should tell Mrs. Calhoun," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "We should probably tell Reverend Finch," she said. "Next week," he said. "Monroe, Edna," he said, in the voice she particularly loved, the one that was completely level and completely deliberate and contained entire ranges of feeling that he expressed in no other register. "Let me have this evening." She looked at him for a long moment in the firefly-lit dusk of a Texas summer, and she said, "Yes," in the way she always said yes to him, fully, without reservation, with the quality of a woman who has learned the difference between surrender and trust and has made her peace with the second one. The child arrived in the middle of February, on a cold, bright morning that was, Monroe would later note with considerable satisfaction, exactly 1 year after their wedding day, give or take a few hours. It was a boy. They named him Thomas, after the stable master's quick-footed son who had carried the message to the schoolroom, which when they told him produced in the boy a pride so enormous it seemed likely to cause structural damage. Thomas Ellsworth was born squalling with a set of lungs that impressed the midwife and a head of dark hair that was entirely from his mother, and a jaw of improbable squareness that was entirely from his father. Monroe held him in the first hour of his life with the specific carefulness of a man handling something irreplaceable, and Edna watched this from the bed where she was exhausted and warm and present with every part of herself, and she thought, there it is, the whole of it. The town received the news with the warm enthusiasm that small communities bring to births, which is a particular kind of joy that acknowledges continuity, the sense that life persists and compounds and produces things that could not have been predicted from any single point in the story. Mrs. Calhoun knitted a blanket. Margaret Hatch made 3 different food contributions over the first week. Every student from the school sent a card, some of them barely legible and all of them precious. Thomas, the stable boy, came to look at the baby with the expression of a boy simultaneously delighted by and deeply suspicious of all babies, which was accurate. Edna returned to teaching in September, with the second teacher now managing the younger students, which freed her to focus on the older ones and to begin developing a more sophisticated curriculum. She had begun corresponding with the State Board of Education in Austin about establishing a proper school district in the county, with standardized materials and a small central library, an ambition that was several years from realization, but that she pursued with the methodical persistence of a woman who has learned that the important things take time. Monroe continued as deputy sheriff, and in the spring of 1885, when the sitting sheriff retired, he was appointed to the position by the county commissioners without opposition, which he accepted with the same equanimity with which he accepted most things, doing the job without theater and without any revision of his fundamental manner. They had a second child in 1886, a girl this time, whom they named Clara, after Edna's mother, who had died when Edna was young, and who had left behind only the certificate of education and the conviction that a woman's mind was worth as much as she chose to make of it. Clara arrived in the world considerably more quietly than her brother had, with big dark eyes and a thoughtful expression that Monroe identified at 3 weeks as belonging definitively to Edna, and Edna identified at 3 weeks as belonging definitively to Monroe, and they argued about this with great pleasure for several months without resolution. On a Sunday in the autumn of 1887, 5 years after Monroe had crossed a street and placed himself between a woman and a bell, they walked along the creek road in the gold October afternoon, which is what they always did on Sundays and which showed no sign of ever stopping. Thomas, who was 4, ran ahead along the path with the absolute confidence of a child who has never had reason to fear the world. Clara, who was 1, rode on Monroe's left hip with her fist in his collar and her eyes on everything with the wide-open attention of someone who has just discovered that existence is endlessly interesting. Edna walked beside Monroe with her hand through his arm, and the cottonwoods were going yellow, and the creek ran low and silver in the afternoon light, and the sky was that particular blue that belongs to Texas in autumn, deep and cloudless and enormous. "What are you thinking?" Monroe said. She considered the question. She had been thinking about the first time they had walked this road, in November of 1882, and about the way the world had looked from inside the fear she had been carrying then, the specific quality of a horizon that appears to be closing rather than opening. She had been thinking about the distance between that woman and this one, not a distance measured in miles or years, but in the kind of inward geography that is the hardest ground to cover. "I was thinking," she said, "about bells." He glanced at her. "I was thinking about the specific moment when something stops being frightening," she said. "Not all the way and not forever, but the moment when it is no longer the loudest thing." He looked ahead to where Thomas was crouching over something in the path, a stone or an insect or any of the 1,000 objects that are enormously significant at age 4. "Is it quieter now?" he said. "Much," she said. "Good," he said in the voice of a man to whom this mattered more than most things. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder as they walked, which was a gesture she had not been capable of in the early months, the simple act of resting against someone, of trusting that the person beside you is not going to use your leaning against you. "Monroe," she said. "Edna," he said. "I am very happy," she said. "I know," he said. "You always know," she said. "It's my line of work," he said. She laughed, which was a sound she had been making more and more freely over the years, a clear, real laugh without performance or apology, and Monroe smiled the way he smiled when she laughed, which was not a large smile but was completely genuine and was, she had told him once, one of the finest things she had ever seen. Thomas looked up from his stone or his insect and called to them to come and see, and they went to see, and Clara made a sound of great interest from Monroe's hip, and the cottonwoods stood gold around them, and the creek ran silver, and the sky was as wide as everything. Some years later, when the children were older and had begun to ask the questions that children ask about how things began, Edna would tell the story of the bell. She told it plainly and without embellishment, the way she told most important things, standing in the kitchen on a Saturday morning with the coffee on and Monroe at the table with the newspaper, half listening in the way that he always listened to her, which was to say fully. She told it the way it had happened. She had been standing in the street, and the bell had rung and she had flinched. And a man she did not yet know had crossed the street and placed himself between her and the sound, without a word, without explanation, without asking for anything in return. Thomas, who was old enough by then to be developing the angular jaw and the amber eyes of his father, said, "Why didn't he say anything?" And Monroe, without looking up from his newspaper, said, "Because sometimes a thing that needs doing doesn't need explaining." Thomas thought about this for a moment. "Is that why you're the sheriff?" He said, "One of the reasons," Monroe said. Clara, who was younger and had the creek-water eyes of her mother, and a directness that had been noted by essentially every adult who had met her, said, "Did you know you were going to love each other?" Edna set down her coffee cup and looked at Monroe, and Monroe looked at her over the top of the newspaper. And the 5 years of Sundays and firefly evenings and cold winter mornings and hot summer afternoons and the accumulated weight of a life built carefully and in trust was there between them in the look. "I knew something," Monroe said. "What?" Clara said. "I knew she was someone worth crossing the street for," he said. Edna looked at him for a long moment, in the kitchen of the house on the north end of town in Harlan Creek, Texas, in the late morning of a Saturday in whatever year it happened to be, and she thought, "I came a very long way to be here. I took a very long road, through a great deal of country I would not have chosen, and I arrived in a place I had not known to look for." And the man at the table with the newspaper and the jaw that suggested considerable stubbornness, and the amber eyes that missed nothing, who had stood between her and the frightening things without requiring her to explain why they were frightening, looked back at her with the full weight of his attention and the particular warmth that was his version of everything, and she thought, this is what it was all for. This, exactly this. The bell at the courthouse rang on a Thursday afternoon in March, the way it always did at 4 o'clock, the way it had been ringing since before either of them had come to Harlan Creek. Edna was walking back from the school, her coat buttoned against the last cold of the season, her basket on her arm, and the bell rolled across the town the way it always did, enormous and brass and indifferent to the individual histories of the people it tolled over. She did not flinch. She walked through the sound without breaking her stride, which was not something she had needed to work at or decide consciously, but had simply become true over the years in the way that things become true when you live inside their opposite long enough and with enough company. The sound rolled past her and she walked through it, and at the end of the block Monroe was coming out of the sheriff's office, his coat on and his hat in his hand, and he looked up and saw her. He waited for her at the end of the block. She walked to him and he offered his arm, which was what he did in the afternoons when their paths converged, and she put her hand through it, which was what she did, and they walked home together through the last gold of the afternoon. He did not say anything about the bell. He did not need to. He had been watching and he had seen, and he understood what he was seeing in the same way he had always understood her, which was to say completely, without requiring explanation, without asking her to name the things she felt in any way beyond the fact of them. They walked the familiar 3 blocks home in the March afternoon, and the children would be there, and there would be supper to make and the newspaper to read and Monday's lessons to prepare, and the 100 small and irreplaceable components of a life that was, in all its specific and ordinary detail, exactly and precisely enough. She had come a long way for it. She had earned every foot of it. And walking beside the man who had moved between her and the sound on a September afternoon 5 years past, she thought, I am not flinching anymore. She thought, I am home.